Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with more fun with Theodor Adorno, the impenetrable German musicologist and philosopher whose writings are oft quoted and little understood. Or let's put it this way, once you've bothered to understand them, you realize that life is like way too short. So here is a slight tome of his essays on music. There you go, newly translated. Oh God, pity the translator. So we've already talked about his negative opinion of jazz. I mean, most of his opinions actually are negative, unless they're like Schoenberg and other things. But here's the problem with Adorno. The problem with Adorno is that aside from being a musicologist, which is really the only thing that people are sort of interested in now as far as his writings go, he was a philosopher, which is never a good idea, particularly if you happen to be German. And he talked about other things. And it's the other things that often get him into trouble because they get all tangled up into his thoughts on music. You know, there's a great German philosopher story. It has nothing to do with Adorno, but some of you may know it. I think I'd share it anyway. You know, after Mendelssohn revived Bach's St. Matthew Passion, it was a big deal in Leipzig, and there was, a gala concert, and there was a banquet afterwards for participants and heavy-duty people, and Mendelssohn was sitting next to, Countess, who knows what the hell her name was, and apparently next to the Countess was some disgusting old man who was like ogling her and making vulgar jokes and generally speaking being offensive to the ladies. And finally the Countess of whatever turns to Mendelssohn and says, "Mr. Mendelssohn, who is this revolting man next to me?" And Mendelssohn says, "Oh, that's Hegel." Everybody knows that. Anyway. So, I don't know what that has to do with this, but it's a good story. And back in my days, when I was classical music director at WJHU in Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, when we were still the campus radio station. Now it's Maryland Public Radio. It's a big deal. But in those days, we were getting this power increase to become a major station and whatnot. And there was only really one employee. Everyone else was a student. We were all volunteering. The employee was named Irene. She was the office manager and secretary, and she was an absolutely wonderful human being. And she used to make a few extra bucks typing papers for us students, in her spare time. And one of my DJs was a philosophy major. And, he had no sense of humor whatsoever. It was just, he was totally out in the clouds. I mean, it's what you'd expect from a philosophy major. So Irene is typing one of his papers, and I was hanging out in the office programming things, and I started reading it. And it was all about wholeness. That is, a wholeness, that things that were whole. Somehow it just went on and on about this, talking about Spinoza and things. I remember Spinoza was in there somewhere and other stuff. And I said to him, well, what happens if you only have a halfness? And he looked at me and he said, "What's a halfness?" I said, "A halfness is half of a wholeness. If you take a wholeness and cut it in two, you have two halfnesses. Two halfnesses make a wholeness." And he just looked at me and said, "There's no such thing as a halfness." I said, "Well, how do you know that?" And on it went. I mean, he just never got it. It was like, well, Adorno is like that. Frankly, he really is. I mean, just people said, "Oh, he really had a good sense of humor in real life." It's like, yeah, okay, yeah, right, sure. Anything you say, pal. So here we have his essay on the form of the phonograph record. Now, some of you asked me, by the way, to, do lots of these. I make it a series. This will be a short series because, like I said, life is too short, but it can be fun as long as it lasts. A few juicy things. Notice that he's saying the form of the phonograph record. He's not talking about the phonograph record itself. And this is in 1934. So we're dealing with shellac 78s. Let's not forget. And the stuff here is well, you'll see. You'll see. I'm going to read the opening paragraph, which is only a page and a quarter. A short paragraph for Adorno, with all the verbs at the end, of course, in German. You ready? Here we go. One does not want to accord it any other form other than the one it itself exhibits. A black pane made of a composite mass, which these days no longer has its honest name any more than automobile fuel is called benzene, fragile like tablets with a circular label in the middle that still looks most authentic when adorned with the pre-war terrier, hearkening to his master's voice. At the very center, a little hole that is at times so narrow that one has to re-drill it wider so that the record can be laid upon the platter. It is covered with curves, a deliberately scribbled, utterly illegible writing. He should talk. Whoa, baby. Talk about the pot calling the kettle black. Whoa. All right. Which here and there forms more plastic figures for reasons that remain obscure to the layman upon listening. Structured like a spiral, it ends somewhere in the vicinity of the title label, to which it is sometimes connected by a lead-out groove so that the needle can comfortably finish its trajectory. In terms of its form, quote unquote, this is all that it will reveal. As perhaps the first of the technological artistic inventions, it already stems from an era that cynically acknowledges the dominance of things over people through the emancipation of technology from human requirements and human needs, and through the presentation of achievements whose significance is not primarily humane. Instead, the need is initially produced by advertisement, once the thing already exists and is spinning in its own orbit. Well, there's a sentence for you, isn't it? Okay. Nowhere does there arise anything that resembles a form specific to the phonographic record. What the hell does that mean? In the way that one was generated by photography in its early days. Just as the call for radio-specific music remained necessarily empty and unfulfilled and gave rise to nothing better than some directions for instrumentation that turned out to be impracticable, so too there has never been any gramophone-specific music. Ooh, is that not true? But that's another issue, isn't it? Indeed, one ought to credit the phonograph record with the advantage of having been spared the artisanal transfiguration of artistic specificity in the arty private home. Furthermore, from their phonographic origins up through the electrical process, which, for better and for worse, may well be closely related to the photographic process of enlargement, the phonograph records were nothing more than the acoustic photographs that the dog so happily recognizes. It is no coincidence that, in German, the term plate, Platten, actually, is used without any modification and with the same meaning in both photography and phonography. It designates the two-dimensional model of a reality that can be multiplied without limit, displaced both spatially and temporally, and traded on the open market. This at the price of sacrificing its third dimension, its height, and its abyss. I can't go on. Anyway, you get the picture, don't you? It's abyss. It has to end with abyss. I mean, sentences, big, long German philosophical paragraphs that end with the word abyss get extra points in the philosophy sweepstakes. Look, I mean, the trouble with Adorno, and it's not, it's criticism of these guys is facile. He was a brilliant man. He was an important man, a major guy in his day. And who am I? I'm just a schmageggy nobody. But here's the thing. I always said to myself, Dave, I said to myself, if you're going to do something, just pick one thing and do it right. Really do the one thing. I did that, for example, with my studies of vibrato and performance practice, where I said to myself, none of these people know anything. Let's really do the research and see where it leads us so that we could really dig down and figure it out. And that I did that. I mean, I confess, I did that. And it's like this with music. I could talk about the weather. I could talk about politics. I could talk about commerce and the economy and all kinds of other things. But I don't. I talk about music. Why? Because other people are more qualified to do it than I am, and they will probably do it better than I would. And the thing with Adorno here is that he talks about things he doesn't know anything about and just pontificates philosophically the form of the record. It's from that concept of its form comes a whole disquisition on its purpose and greater meaning. But the problem is that where he goes is where he always goes. Anti-capitalist, anti-technology, anti modern civilization. It's such an old story. It really is. And it's just dressed up in extravagant language, in confusing language, in highfalutin, elevated language. But his points are just so utterly mundane. We've heard it all before, and there you go. But anyway, I just wanted to share that little paragraph with you. And maybe we'll do a couple more of these, because they're just fun to do. I'm having a lovely time reading them out loud. I think they make more of an impression when they're exposed in a public kind of way. Anyway, so I hope you enjoyed that little story from Uncle Davy. Keep on listening, friends, and thanks for joining me. Take care.